Well, good morning, good afternoon to you all, and thank you for joining us today for our Clarity Factory webinar, CSO Insights 2025 Corporate Security Data and Trends for 2026. It's a real pleasure to welcome you here with us today. We're going to be drawing today on data from the Clarity Factory's 2025 annual CSO survey, which I hope many of you have had a chance to review already. I'd firstly like to thank the sponsors for the 2025 annual CSO survey. Ontic, our platinum sponsor, and our gold sponsors, Emergent Risk International and ASIS International. Thank you to them all for helping to make the 2025 survey possible. I'd also like to extend a special thank you for the members of our CSO Advisory Council for the survey, of which Jules is one member, and I know a number of other members are dialing in today. Thank you for the insight that you provided to both shape the survey so that we were asking the questions that really mattered to you all, and working with us on the analysis so that it landed quite as well as it did. A couple of housekeeping points before we dive into the subject matter today. The first is to say that we are recording today's session, and we will be sharing that with you and everybody else who signed up to attend after the seminar. You should get that in the next 24 hours or so. It'll also be available on the Clarity Factory website if you'd like to share it with your teams and more widely. We'll be using the Q&A function today. So as we're going through, if you've got questions, comments, feedbacks, maybe issues you disagree with the speakers on, please add your thoughts to the Q&A. I'll be keeping an eye on that throughout, and we'll bring thoughts in as we go, and we'll also have some time for questions at the end. I'll use those questions anonymously. So don't worry about being called out individually. We won't be naming folks who are asking questions. We're aiming to finish at least 5 minutes ahead of the hour, because I imagine many of you are then going straight off to your next appointment. So we wanted to make sure that you've got a few minutes to take a breath and grab another coffee before you go into the next thing. So we're joined today by three fantastic speakers whose opinions I turn to time and time again to figure out what's happening and what we need to make of it. Firstly, Manish Mehta, who is Chief Innovation Officer at Ontic. Manish has got decades of experience in technology and product development, and I pick his brain probably a little bit more often than he would like, but I find him to be such a useful resource for our work and for our community. Meredith Wilson is founder and chief executive officer of Emergent Risk International. I draw on her expertise, and I know that many of you on this call have her on speed dial to make sense of geopolitical events and what it means for you and your teams. And thirdly, Jules Parke-Robinson, who is global head of security and market safety at Philip Morris International. Great career in a number of places in the corporate security sphere, and also comes with a very distinguished military police career before her as well. So in terms of the sort of the topic at hand, I guess I've been knocking around the corporate security world for 25 years. And I would say with some confidence that there has never been a point in time at which our community has been characterized by having as many challenges, but also as many opportunities. And let me say a little bit about both to lead us into the conversation. The quote that you'll see in front of you now from Bill Tenney, who's the CEO of ASIS International, I think sums up one half of that equation. And I know that many of our clients, many of you on this call, many of the collaborators we have are feeling overwhelmed, and like the global security situation is pretty relentless on most days of the week at the moment. And yet there are so many opportunities that are coming our way, both in terms of the top of the house being far more interested in the issues that we care about, some of the opportunities that technology offers us. And so I think it's actually a really exciting and still challenging time for us who work in corporate security. And I think that sort of dual-sided challenge and opportunity is something which came out really clearly in our survey data this year. We introduced our annual CSO survey because against this backdrop, it's our conviction that it's more important than ever that CSOs and their teams are benchmarking, driving efficiencies, productivity, and ensuring that their program is really fit, not just for today, but for fast-moving tomorrow as well. So without further ado, let's get started. And this is going to be a conversation, and I'm really looking forward to your input as well. So firstly, we asked CSOs to rank the security risks facing their organization from critical to low. And you'll see the data represented on the chart in front of you. The purple represents the critical down to the gray, which is the low. And you'll see all of those security risks listed down the left-hand side of the graph. And as we always tend to see in our surveys, cybersecurity almost always sits at the top, even among CSOs as well as CISOs, closely followed, as you'll see, by data security, geopolitical risk, extreme weather events, and insider risk. Now, I always find it interesting to geek out over data like this. So I'd love to know a little bit more about how our panelists responded to it. Maybe I'll turn to you first, Manish. Was there anything in that data that kind of surprised you and jumped out at you?
Yeah, Rachel, first of all, fantastic survey. I geek out on the data as well. I think the top threats make a ton of sense. As you highlighted, those are board level. They often include enterprise level risks, but the two that stood out to me, one was the threats to senior executives. And I know we're going to have a conversation in a bit about executive protection, but that one stood out. And the other one was workplace violence. And I do wonder if many organizations still see these as isolated incidents rather than enterprise level vulnerabilities, even though they can cause operational and reputational harm when we see this with our clients all the time. So to me, that was a big surprise. I thought those would be on par with the top tier risks.
Yeah, I would agree. And as we'll talk about in a couple of moments, as you alluded, they're part of a bigger trend, I think, which, as you say, takes them from being isolated to more enterprise wide. Jules, I'll turn to you next. How does this, I don't know how you answered the survey because it's anonymous, but how did these findings relate to how you experience things on a day-to-day level with PMI? Is there anything that you expected to see higher or lower?
I think there were two that stood out for me, Rachel. The biggest surprises were really supply chain and organised crime. I expected them to be further up the list. Although it's interesting when you go into the full survey and then you see the difference between the answers given by UK-based CSOs versus US-based CSOs, it's slightly different. And actually, it was rated higher by the UK CSOs. I think my other observation was really around third-party risk, which I thought was a bit odd, languishing at the bottom, because I see that very much aligned or expected it to sit alongside cybersecurity and data security. But actually, when you look at the data itself, you can see that it's actually a very high risk. It's just not graded critical in quite the same way. But it's interesting to see how those interdependencies between different risks isn't necessarily reflected in that same way. So yeah, fascinating graph, absolutely.
Yeah, and always stuff for us to take on for next year about, did we ask the questions correctly? Is there a way we can tweak it to sort of avoid some of those issues that you talked about? And so do you think that CSOs on the whole, and maybe I'm sort of drawing you into your knowledge of how your peers are thinking about these things, do you think that CSOs and their teams need to pay more attention than they are doing to issues like supply chain and third party, which may not be part of their immediate functional responsibilities, but which, of course, they have an important contribution to make towards and are, as you say, really critical to the business?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, and we will again, like Manish said, when we talk about executive protection later, we'll come to some of this idea about breaking down silos. Quite often people will leave this responsibility within supply chain or within procurement. And I think this is not about us necessarily owning the problem, but being part of the solution. So I absolutely think we need to lean into this space more.
Yeah. And so, I think kind of what we're saying is that, some issues are consistently on top of charts like this, and we find that in our surveys time and time again. There's certain stuff that just rises to the top for everybody. I guess, you know, some are more sector specific than others, you know, depending on what your supply chain looks like. It may be further up your graph or further down your graph, depending on what the business looks like. And yeah, a need to sort of look at how you work across those silos within the business. Geopolitics was number 3 here when we asked the question in this way. And I wonder, Meredith, if I might sort of bring up our geopolitics data specifically, because we did ask CSOs out of just geopolitics, then what does it look like for your organizations? And, you know, we see a real concentration at the top of that graph around global economic uncertainty, cyber threats again, China, Taiwan. Does this sort of balance kind of chime with what you're seeing from your clients who represent a very broad range of sectors, obviously?
Yeah, it does and it doesn't. I think there's, you know, at least for what we've been experiencing this year, I think those top 3 are there for everybody. And that's one of the reasons you see such a large representation there. Whereas as you go further down, again, just like those other, your last slide, you know, it then starts to be more dependent on the sector. It depends on the location. It depends on what that company has got their, you know, their security department focused on. You know, some companies may take the geopolitical stuff out of security, and they may be working more with the government affairs group or somebody like that. And so, yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, just the way that it looks right now based on kind of where things are, you know, what we've seen this year.
And can I just jump on that question of government affairs functions, if you don't mind? And then I've got another question I'd love to pose to you. But while you mentioned that, it's one of the things that has really, really stood out for me through 2025. As you can imagine, I, like all of you, speak to chief security officers most weeks of the year. I mean, very often to get a sense of where people are, what their concerns are, etc. And it's one of the things that has really, really jumped out at me. And it's not to say it's new, that relationship with government affairs is new, because of course it's not. But I was really struck in 2025 by how prominent it had become. Are you finding that with your clients as well?
It depends on the client, but there is, and I think there has always historically been a little bit of a push-pull between government affairs and security when it comes to the geopolitical stuff. And traditionally, government affairs for a lot of companies really functions more as a lobbying organization. So while they're involved from more of a relationship building perspective. They tend not to do a lot on the analysis side, but every government affairs organization that I know of has a Eurasia Group subscription, and they tend to own that. And then there just tends to be kind of a battle over who gets to have an opinion about, about global affairs. It doesn't have to be that way. I think there's a really symbiotic relationship that can be developed where you're actually, almost creating an intelligence cycle there, because these folks are exposed to a lot of world leaders. They are exposed to a lot of these meetings, and they can provide that information to the analysis team, and the analysis team can kind of drive forward more of the, here's what we know, here's what this might look like. So there's an incredible opportunity there to collaborate when people can get around the political battles.
Yeah, and that's it. And I hope we'll see more of that in 2026. It's one of the things that we sort of flagged in the survey report, was the need to kind of align those relationships. Can I, if this is what 2025 looks like on average, obviously, for those who answered the survey, which was around 100 CSOs. What are you expecting to look different, if anything, in 2026? And maybe I'll also ask Jules and Manish the same question in a second if they have something to add. But what are you expecting to see different next year, Meredith?
Yeah, I sat down this morning and my list got really long, really fast. But I think all of these things that are here None of them are going away. One of the key things we're watching for right now, of course, is the Supreme Court verdict on the tariffs, because a lot of that economic uncertainty, rising trade nationalism, all of that kind of stuff is wrapped up in that bucket. But regardless, you're still going to have that economic uncertainty, because if it's not that lever of power, it will be something else that takes its place, and it will be economic in one way or another. Gen Z protests. We've started to see this in countries all over Africa, Middle East, places like that. We're likely to see continuation of that, especially as we're starting to see slightly higher amounts of layoffs, job losses, people correlating job loss with AI, whether or not that's actually the case. So those things are going to drive more discontent in the coming year. That may come back in the, as backlash to tech companies or other companies that are adding AI to their tech stack. And then I think the one of the big economic questions is the AI bubble. Is it really a bubble? Is that going to lead to more market uncertainty, that type of thing? But yeah, I mean, I could go on for hours. I'll let Jules and Manish add some of their thoughts on that.
Manish.
Oh my goodness, Meredith hit the nail on the head on this one. I think the word to put in bold is uncertainty in all the aspects that she covered. I think that will just amplify in the coming year. So nothing more to add. Jules?
I think the only thing that could be interesting is to see how this question is answered next year, because one of the things that's right up there at the top is cyber threats. And I'm not saying that the risk will go down, but I think maybe our understanding and awareness of the risk, and therefore our ability to respond to it, might be greater, and therefore it might not be recognized quite as high as it is now. So it'll be interesting to see how that evolves. Interesting.
Well, we will know at some point next year, circa September. CSOs will have their say, and we will find out. Looking forward to that. We're already hard at work on next year's survey, actually. One of the opportunities that we highlighted, and actually we started this conversation already, so we'll just sort of close the loop on that. But one of the opportunities we highlighted in this year's survey was the opportunity for corporate security intel teams to offer their insight not just to the corporate security team, but more widely across the business as well. And certainly amongst my network, I see some companies doing this incredibly effectively, others at quite different levels of maturity in that way. Meredith, this is your bread and butter, right? And how do you see intel teams doing in this regard at the moment? Are they managing to sort of bridge that gap between delivering for the team, but also delivering for the team at large, if you put it that way? What's your perspective on sort of levels of maturity and progress in that sense?
Yeah, it as you mentioned, it's all over the board, right? You've got from 0 to 100 in terms of where people are at. I go back to where I came from, which was oil and gas, and those companies still are some of the best at really driving the strategic intel into the C-suite, because they've had several decades to do it, right? And they've been working at this for years and years and years, whereas other companies have only just built this in the last few years. We've seen other industries that have been very cyclical in, yes, we need this, no, we don't need this. So we'll see, a big intel team be built, and then 2 years later, they're like, yeah, no, we don't need this, and out it goes. And so it really is it's very broad in terms of impact. And, and I think there's kind of three key things that that can really help make one of those functions stick and make those functions really successful at the executive level, because they can go along for years in the security group just supporting the regional security directors and things like that and be very effective in that way. But when they really are aiming for hitting the C-suite and really getting outside of the security group, which is where I like to see them. There is sometimes a different type of intel that's required where it needs to be more strategic, but you can't be doing that if you aren't answering the tactical mail, right? So if you're not doing the tactical stuff right, you really can't do the strategic stuff. But I think importantly, context. So that team really needs to understand the context that they're operating in, which is what are the day-to-day concerns of the people outside of security? So are they able to plug their intel into the decisions that are being made, not into the sort of national security mindset that they might have come from? Credibility, have they been able to build credibility across the business? So have they made those relationships? Have they gone and talked to people face to face? Have they really, have they been able to give them things that are useful in the past that helps them build that credibility? And, are they actually knowledgeable about China if they're sitting in Houston, Texas, right? Have they built their credibility on that? And then the last thing is consistency. And providing good information, reliable information, non-emotive analysis that isn't full of personal opinions, that isn't coming from a far left source or a far right source. If they've shown consistency in their ability to do that, all of those things really contribute to to a function that can work throughout the business and not just in the security group.
So the kind of the 3 C's really.
Yeah.
Context, credibility, and consistency. I love nothing more than alliteration. But
exactly.
yeah, that's those the 3 C's are the watchwords, right? Jules, you're responsible for trying to make this happen in practice. So if the theory is the 3 C's, well, it's not, because Meredith is very involved on a practical level as well. From your perspective within the function, what are you seeing, and what are the roadblocks, the challenges that you're, and do you actually even agree that there should be this dual role for corporate security intel, both within the function and more broadly within the business?
I think it's a real practical challenge, is that how you get that balance right, and teams tend to lean one way or the other, like heavily into the security space or heavily into the broader sort of business space. So seeing it done well is relatively rare. And I think, as Meredith put out with her 3 C's, there are a number of key things which are the sort of success factors that sit around it. So firstly, where does the team sit? So if it sits within corporate security, but then where does corporate security sit? And I know that's a bigger question, but that will then really dictate the visibility and the traction that the intel team is going to get in the first place. What's the composition and structure of that team? How is it resourced? What's the staffing strategy? Are they FTEs, or is it a combination of FTEs and contractors, or are they all embedded analysts? Because whether we like it or not, depending on the organization, there can be a different reaction depending on the type of person that's giving you that analysis and advice. And then I think also, are they empowered? Are they gatekept by the regional security director? Are they the ones that are then passing that intelligence to the stakeholders? And therefore, is the product getting to the right person that actually it's going to make an impact and a difference at the end? And then the perennial is the analysis relevant, or is it something that I can, see on, the news channel, or is it something that is absolutely relevant and pertinent to my organization? So how well do the teams actually understand the broader business? So they must develop this sort of capability of the intel requirements management function, so that they're the cog between, what are the business objectives, and are we aligned with, actually producing a product that supports that business objective? And actually, how do they shape the intelligence collection plan to make sure they deliver against that? Because they've got to give decision advantage to the business stakeholders. Otherwise, they're always going to be underutilized and undervalued. So if you want to get them that visibility, and that, you need to empower them, but they need to understand the business, and they need to understand how the product they can produce actually gives decision advantage to the business.
Exactly. And I wonder if it's a good moment, because so much of what we've talked about kind of comes back to this issue of silos, doesn't it? And you can swim in your own lane very effectively, but that doesn't mean you're doing a great job for the business. Your ability to connect both your data, your personnel, your influence across those silos is so very critical. Manish, I feel like this is the conversation me and you have on a fairly regular basis, and I know it's something that you think about a lot. And of course, the Ontic platform does such a great job of helping to navigate across and connect across those silos. I'll just, as I sort of ask you a question, I'll just flash up for those dialing in some of the data that we got about collaboration, because the good news is that collaboration is critical for corporate security teams, and our data shows that they are doing it, and they're doing it in varying degrees of consistency and regularity. But we are seeing clear data to show that collaboration is happening. And also, if I were to show you a different slide that looks at areas of accountability for the function, you also see that while corporate security functions have their core areas, they are also now involved in other parts of the business in kind of more and less formal ways as well. But, and this is a data point we've nerded over, I know, Manish, 77% of CSOs say that fragmented data and silos continue to negatively affect the effectiveness of their function. So I guess a lot of this is probably happening quite manually. Talk to us about tools, data, processes, technology that can help CSOs do it faster and do it better.
Rachel, as a technologist and an outsider to the security industry, I cannot emphasize enough, to me, how sinister silos are. They are the enemy. And it's tragic. And we see this across the industry. It doesn't matter the sector, it doesn't matter the geography. But if you look at an after-action analysis, often you find that some organization, some team had that critical intelligence, had that information during that critical need. So what are silos that you can address through technology? Well, there's silos you can't. You can't bridge silos that are cultural or organizational. But if you think about silos that are tool-oriented processes, workflows, or data, as you mentioned, those can be bridged. And I think what you have to do first is connect the dots. And there are many ways to do this, and there's lots of tools out there. But what we forget often with connecting the dots, we tend to think about it in a transient moment and reactive. So you have that information, and then that information often disappears. So as a technologist, we believe that that information should be stored in a system of record so that you start to build up a history and a corpus of information that can be used over time. Then you connect the dots. So you unify the data and you start to bridge silos that exist. So if one organization and a team that's running the GSOC or running an investigation or insider risk or an executive protection team, or you're managing workplace violence or you're conducting a risk assessment, all of that data and information can be bridged. Then you streamline the workflows and collaboration across the teams. And when you do this, when you unify the data, when you start to collaborate and bridge and streamline those workflows, you start to elevate the insights and you have this shared understanding of risk. So the shorthand I like to use for this is collect, connect to protect.
Absolutely. And what do you find is I guess, two follow-up questions. What do you find is the hardest thing for teams to get started on that journey? What's the thing that they kind of get started and go, oh, I've got to do that. We've got to, what is that one thing that kind of trips them up early, which they can then iron out and move forward? And what's the biggest win for them if they get this right?
Yeah, I think the advantage in all of this is to shift from being reactive to proactive. And the only way you can do that is if you train and learn. Now, AI will come at some point and turbocharge this, but let's start with just collecting the data and storing it and using that data over time to learn and improve rather than being reactive and transient. So what I mean by that, just to underscore the point, there could be an incident, there could be an event, there could be a moment. And if we as a security organization and industry simply react to every one of those moments without building that knowledge repository and that knowledge base will always be reactive. So I think there's a huge opportunity to store the data, train and learn from that data, and shift to being more proactive.
That's great. Thank you. And Jules, I'm struck by your experience as a leader within the corporate security domain. We've talked about this a number of times that, you sort of found yourself in a fairly unusual position, which was helping to set up a new function for a brand new, enormous multinational corporation at Haleon. You took over at Philip Morris International, I guess, about a year or so or two ago. So how is this a challenge you've grappled with, and are the roadblocks and the opportunities, does that chime with what Manish is saying?
Yeah, I think for me, it's very much about how do you leave your ego at the door and break down those barriers. You don't have to own everything, but you need to actually then understand who the stakeholders are, and you need to have good communication skills and then be able to engage with other people. I think sometimes people tend to use kind of crisis as an opportunity to sort of land grab, and that can be a really risky strategy in terms of the way that we do that. So it's really about just understanding, having those conversations, understanding other people's challenges, and then being able to say, okay, well, how can I help you? It's very much having that clear purpose and vision, which is about being an enabler rather than a blocker. So you've got to have a really clear narrative about what you bring to the party, so that people understand that you're not creating an existential threat to them by trying to engage in this conversation. It's about how can we help connect the dots together.
Yeah, and it's often said, isn't it, never waste a good crisis. But I think what you're both saying is that's precisely the wrong time to get, while the sun is shining, get your data in order, get the processes, and then actually when the crisis happens, you are in a much better position to deal with that effectively. And it's a real benefit, and I guess a moment to really demonstrate value as a result of that.
Because I think the risk is if you don't do that and you don't have that approach, then what you do is you gain that extra traction, but it could be temporary. If you haven't got the substance behind it, then you're actually exposing yourself for the long term. So it's about building, those relationships and really, from a constant and a consistent approach to make sure that when that crisis does come, then everybody's connected and you have those processes and those relationships, because it's people that make this thing work.
People respond to people. Absolutely. Let's if we may turn to one of the special areas of focus that we highlighted in this year's survey, executive protection, an area of special focus. I guess no surprise to anyone why we chose this and why we chose this. And I know that for many on this call, executive protection and the issues that surround it have been front of mind over the past year. Of course, we're just approaching the 1-year anniversary of the murder of Brian Thompson. There have been a number of other incidents over the past year that we've heard about, many more that we won't have heard about. And certainly our data shows us that, as you'll see here, executive protection is an issue for organizations. It's rated highly. As Manish said earlier, maybe for some it didn't sort of appear as high up that graph as we would have expected. Let's dive into that. But we're also, another data point that we have is increased spending on executive protection programs and increased resourcing within them as well. So we do get the sense that executives understand this is an issue. Executives are responding with additional resources. And in some of the interviews that we conducted as part of the survey, CSOs told us about less friction from the top of the house about putting up with some of the inconveniences that can arise as a result of some aspects of executive protection. I see this as part of a broader trend, as I said earlier, executive protection, protest, sort of threats, etc. I think it's part of a broader trend whereby companies and their executives, by extension, are seen as being "quote unquote" fair game by some. And I'm going to be interested to see how this plays out in 2026 and beyond. Jules, from your perspective, without sort of revealing anything that could be sensitive clearly, but from your perspective, do you get the sense amongst your peers that the picture I'm painting feels representative? How are corporate leadership responding to this, and do they see that this is part of a broader trend that they need to take notice of, or see it as sort of isolated one-off events?
I think it's a real mixed bag, actually. And I know that, Meredith will probably have a view on the sort of the US UK divide, because I think there's quite a different perspective there. But I think for me, the narrative that we shape here is really, really important to make sure that executives respond in a very positive way. We obviously need to be able to speak truth to power. And so we have to clearly articulate what the threat is and what the risk mitigation measures are. But the challenge is that how do we make sure that we don't appear too heavy-handed or dramatic whilst being both sort of insistent and robust if the threat dictates it. And I think I've seen several occasions where executives have pushed back quite a lot more recently, that, where's that balance between providing the support or actually then being seen from their perspective to draw attention to the issue by providing that resource around them. So I think it's a really, really sort of delicate balance. But I'm sure, Meredith's view in terms of the UK-US divide would be quite interesting here.
Please, Meredith.
Yeah, so when we prepped for this call, just for other people's knowledge, we talked a little bit about there is a lot more data on the U.S. side in terms of what could happen. There's both incident data as well as just it's an issue that a lot of people have looked at in the U.S. There's also a higher perception of threat because of the number of guns on the street. However, when you look at Europe, I think there's almost a sense of complacency there. But when you actually dig into the factors, around protective intelligence and incidents that have happened and things like that, there's actually a number of very serious incidents that have happened in Europe over the last few years. Politicians that have been assassinated or attempted assassinations, various small incidents that there's precedent for it there too. And we know that, what happens in the US oftentimes gets copycatted in other places. And so, and Japan's another example where, this is a place where you have rules everywhere, and yet they have had a number of very high profile incidents over the last few years. And so the data is important, but I think too, actually looking for really the protective intelligence, the ahead of time information is when you really dig into it, you actually find that there is a lot there. And that's where having the right type of person, sometimes the right type of software, my nod to Manish over there, but actually understanding what you're looking for, because a lot of times we are basing our thoughts about what's going to affect people, what the threat is going to be based on what happened in the past. But we also need to have people that are really thinking about what's happening now, whether the threat becomes an AI issue where somebody's creating a clone of an executive, there's so many different ways that we need to protect people, and they're not all physical, but we have to be forward looking enough, and we have to be looking for that information to actually, get to them sometimes the justification for a little bit higher levels of protection.
That's great. And actually, one of the data points that we got from the survey on executive protection was just how the vast majority of programs now are spanning both digital and physical, which was a really positive data point as I saw it. Manish, I know you engage with C-suites a lot. You're in the business of making data more accessible to corporate security teams so they can understand the threat they face, and the future threat. What's your perspective on this?
Rachel, it's remarkably interesting. When we meet our clients for the first time, they often have a standard level of executive protection capabilities and protocols. And then when they start to use technology and they shine a light, they're often very surprised by the threat landscape and they're able to see more clearly. And as a result of that, they have to reshift the way they think about executive protection. So we're starting to see them be more proactive. If you think about risk assessments, if you think about changing personnel protection, I take Jules's point that some executives are going to push back, but Meredith also highlighted some interesting insights and data. So I think the more that you monitor, the more that you start to look out and leverage technology, you'll find a lot more risks out there. And then you have to change your posture before, change your posture during an event, and then take the learnings in your after action analysis and feed that back to the top. And we've seen that work very effectively with EP teams.
That's great. I'm going to remind folks who are on the webinar to post your questions in the chat. We'd love to hear from you. I'll be bringing those in. Yeah, it'd be great, whether it's a question, whether it's a comment, whether it's an observation on what you're hearing, it'd be super. And I'll start to bring those in just a second. And in the conversation there, we're sort of coming back, as we often do, to sort of how you influence at C-suite level, how you ensure that C-suite kind of has enough of an understanding of what the risk looks like so that they can be informed decision makers, whether it's about their own safety or risks that are posed to the business. One of the standout data points from the survey, really, I'm pretty sure it made it onto the front cover of the report this year, possibly even data point number one, I say, looking around for my copy of the report, is the fact that CSOs say that poor understanding of security among business executives is the single biggest obstacle after budget and resourcing, but is the single biggest obstacle to the effectiveness of their team. Surprised me in some ways, didn't surprise me at all. In other ways, depressed me to a certain extent that we were still having that conversation. And I didn't interpret it as a they don't understand us kind of data point. But I think there are obvious questions we have to ask ourselves about how we make sure that we're communicating, influencing at the right level. I'm going to start with you, Manish, because as you've said, and as I said, you do go in at C-suite level with your clients. You hear a lot of feedback from them as they're getting their sort of heads around the technology and the risk for their business and so on and so forth. What was your response to that data point? Did it sort of chime with you, or did it come at you from left field? And how does it relate to your experience of having those conversations in the C-suite?
Oh, Rachel, I have a very passionate opinion on this topic. I do meet with many CSOs, and they share a lot of what was in the survey and in the feedback, that they often feel misunderstood. And I've been very, very fortunate in my career to have reported to a number of C-suite executives. And here's the common misperception. C-suite executives often do not need to understand every function in the business, right? It's important, though, for those leaders to communicate in the language of the business. So it's not about educating an executive on security, but we need to then communicate from their lens. If you think about a C-suite executive, they're responsible for so much in the business that they're going to have a filter and a lens. So we have to learn to speak the language of the business and be able to communicate more effectively. So they would be looking for things like reducing risk and saving time and saving money, critical to how they're thinking about structuring the business and business outcomes. So if we're able to do that effectively, if we're able to communicate from their lens, understand the narrative that would resonate with them, understand the impact of the business and how they filter information, we're gonna see a sea change, and we're gonna have a seat at the table as CSOs, and we'll be seen as effective communicators and real strategic business partners. And I've seen this work time and time again in my career.
And Jules, what works for you?
That's a great answer, Manish, and there's not much I can say to top that. But I think for me, it's about having a really clear and simple vision and purpose that I've mentioned already. So what do we exist to do and why? I mean, they don't need to understand what we do necessarily, but we have to link it to the business. So everything that we do, whether that be delivering timely advice, delivering a security culture, assurance of standards, that end state has to deliver decision advantage to the business. So particularly with intelligence products, for example. So it is very much about what value do we add, and we have to be able to demonstrate that. And then also how we do it. So making sure that we've got the professional knowledge, skills and experience, that we're transparent and act with integrity with stakeholders, really act as a business partner and a business enabler. So it's about that ability to communicate and support the business in their decision making.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not, I mean, the thing I keep coming back to is it's not about educating them. It's about listening, understanding them, and then communicating at a level which gives them a sense of, this is who I am, these are what my values are, this is why you can trust me, and this is why when I say we need more, we do, or when I say we need to change track, you kind of sit down and are willing to have a conversation with me. It's not about explaining all of the detail of the program, every last aspect of the risk focus for the business. And so, yeah, really.
Yeah, I think, Rachel, as CSOs, also to be able to know that we understand the business enough to actually identify those opportunities of where we can add value, because I'm not sure that everybody takes that opportunity to do that.
Yeah, we've got a flurry of questions and comments. Let me draw some of those in. There's a couple of questions which I think are aimed to me, which I'll just sort of cover really quickly, which is, did you collect any data to show how many execs security programs are Intel driven? Yes, please refer to it. We have got a data point on that. Was there any data that shows how many of the companies with EP programs outsource EP officers? Absolutely. We had a question which asked people, is it fully in-house, fully outsourced, or somewhere in the middle? So you will find some data on that. So I'll refer you straight on to the annual survey. I'm going to read some of these and then we'll kind of pick into them. I appreciate the rankings of risks, threats, but wonder whether that is predicated on their frequency and persistency rather than impact. Really good question. CSOs oftentimes ignore the C-suite support staff when trying to get executives to understand their risk exposure. Very good point. Always important to make friends with them as well. Somebody double clicks on Manish's comment. Security executives need to be business minded professionals first, security experts second. Do you feel that supply chain as a component of enterprise resilience is a significant blind spot for many security programs? Jules, I think you would say a resounding yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Anyone else want to come in briefly on that?
Yeah, I would add to that. While it is a blind spot, I think it's also one of those gray areas for some companies where they would like to have more say over that. They would like to be more involved in it, but there is sometimes a misalignment and maybe even a misunderstanding of what the supply chain organization traditionally does and their level of information and sort of understanding of how a security group and particularly intelligence can help with that. So there's an education process that needs to go on there. But I think increasingly for companies, it's becoming a much more central component to their overall business strategy, which includes the security piece, right? So whether it's understanding what kinds of critical minerals are in their supply chain, because that's a second, third, fourth tier issue. A lot of supply chain groups didn't traditionally look at that kind of thing. It could be, whether or not they can get things in and out of port. It could be a tariff issue, but all of those things are things that security groups with a good intelligence function can actually add a lot of value on if they can build those relationships and collaborate.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I've got one here, kind of a Manish question, but would love a take from anyone. I know the report and some of Clarity Factory's offerings focus on storytelling to build security brand equity. We absolutely do. When you're talking to a C-suite member, do stories on their own matter, or does it need to be a story with a big top line number in it, Manish?
They don't always have to have a top line number. I think they need to be memorable and impactful to the business. And there are many, many types from insider risk to personnel risk. They don't have to have a number, but they do need to be memorable.
Do you know, I bumped into somebody last week who had been through our storytelling training course, and he gave us the best compliment for it. He said they have been using the storytelling technique, which is fantastic, but he said we're starting to hear our own stories told back to us. And that is the point. That is the difference between storytelling and a slide deck. They start coming back to you and they start living and breathing on their own. Question for Meredith. You and your firm are well integrated with many firms and are tremendous, in my opinion. Bit of positive feedback there. Based on these results, what advice do you have moving forward for senior security personnel?
That is a really broad question. And thank you for the compliment, Richard. I appreciate it. I actually want to back up for 1 second to the C-suite question. Mm-hmm. The more that I spend time with CEOs, the more that I realize that and also being one myself, but when you think about communicating with the CEO and you're coming at them and you're only talking about security, or you're only talking about, this one thing that is your whole world, I think the easiest way to put that into context is to think that for each and every single person that reports to them, each and every function that they work with, they have somebody coming to them saying, this is my whole world. This is, you have to pay attention to this. You have to pay attention to me. But when you actually look at what they're trying to do every day, really understanding the role that they play there. And this is the same for anyone you talk to across the business. But I think at the C level, a lot of people misunderstand even what they're doing every day and what their specific role is. And it's different from one company to the next. But understanding what decisions does that person have to make each day makes it a lot easier for you to know what to bring to that person and what not to. Somebody mentioned the support staff, right? Sometimes the support staff is as far as you need to go. Sometimes the chief of staff is as far as you need to go. But actually knowing that context, and there's plenty of ways to find that context out. The company itself is going to have a lot of stuff out there that, you see what this person's communicating about versus this those types of things, I think, are really the kind of context clues that you need to know how best to communicate at that level. Which I think I just roll in as my answer to Richard's question too, which is, what advice do you have? So yeah.
Yeah, listening and understanding what to pitch and when, I think, and to whom, I think is an extraordinary piece of advice. We are going to close in a couple of minutes. I promise to give people enough time for a cup of coffee or a cup of tea before you have to go on to your next assignment of the day. Before we do, and before I close with some thank yous, can I just come to each of the speakers in turn for literally 20 seconds? In the survey, we highlighted 3 recommendations for 2026. Prioritize partnership working, invest in communication and storytelling skills, and tighten up talent strategy to meet the needs of today and tomorrow. What would be your one either recommendation or trend to watch in 2026? What's your kind of clarion call for CSOs and their teams? And I will come first to Jules.
That's not fair. I had 3, so I'll do them really quickly. Greater cross-functional collaboration, outsourcing as part of a deliberate strategic plan, and leaning into commercial knowledge and understanding.
Okay, they were all very good, so I'll let you off. Meredith.
So being the Intel person on the call, I'm gonna stick in the Intel space here for a minute. This has been also been my messaging to my own staff this year, is to be really looking forward as we're going into the new year. And I know that sounds really simple, but what I mean by that is when we come to our roles as professionals, we are there because we did something really, really well in the past, right? We did our last job really well, so we moved to this role. We have to, especially now, because things are changing so fast with AI, things are changing so fast with governments, things are changing so fast with business. If we are constantly looking back at what we did well before and not really paying attention to what's in front of us, so basically, protecting for the past, we are going to miss big things. And so, expand your reading sources, expand your intel sources, think beyond just, oh, this is a good newspaper, but really be thinking about what is out there that maybe I'm not seeing because I'm, kind of busy living life every day. So yeah. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And Manish?
3 things to be great at: tech fluency, including analytical skills. Second is cross-functional collaboration well outside of security. And lastly, be amazing storytellers.
I would heartily agree. Listen, thank you so much to our 3 fantastic speakers who have really helped to bring to life the data in the survey. They all played big roles in the survey itself. So thank you for being a part of it, and thank you for sharing here today. For those of you who haven't had a chance yet, go to clarityfactory.com/annual-survey, where you will find it free of charge and open access. I'd also like to thank again our amazing sponsors and partners in this endeavour: Ontic, our platinum sponsor, and our gold sponsors, Emergent Risk International and ASIS International. Go to clarityfactory.com/subscribe if you'd like to get all of this kind of content free of charge every month. And as I mentioned, we are already working hard on the 2026 survey. We've had such positive feedback on the work in 2025, so we are ready to go bigger and bolder in 2026. If you're interested in getting involved, if you're interested in sponsoring, you know where I am. Please get in touch. We really want this to be a data set for the community that feels like it is owned and part of how you do your daily work. Thank you for joining us. Have a great rest of the day, and please expect the video and the feedback form to land in your inbox very, very soon. Thank you.